For today's shipwreck video, we move from the warm Pacific to the cold Baltic, from the Japanese to the Germans, and from cruisers and destroyers to an aircraft carrier, a rather famous one in the form of Germany's only carrier, Graf Zeppelin, resting on the bottom of the Baltic Sea. This wreck is an interesting one, considering just how intact it is, in spite of scuttling by the Germans and target ship duty by the Soviets. There's even fairly minimal rusting, considering how long it's been on the bottom, and, for that matter, how shallow she is. Then again, the Baltic also gave us Vasa, so that isn't terribly surprising. In any case, let's begin with the sinking overview, which, in this case, is at least as interesting as the wreck itself. You see, Graf Zeppelin's fate was something of a mystery for a very long time. It was pretty well known that the ship was never completed, and furthermore that the hulk was scuttled by the Germans. This was in April of 1945 as the Red Army closed in. This scuttling did not, however, destroy the carrier. The hull was still intact, and while the machinery was ruined, the ship could still be refloated, which is what happened as the wrecked hulk was given over to the Soviets, most likely under the understanding that the ship was a waste of material, as well as the simple fact that the Soviets were the ones in control of the wreck. Even with that in mind, the ship was still supposed to be destroyed. And yet, at least to Western eyes, exactly what happened remained a mystery. The Soviets would send a note in late 1947 indicating they had disposed of their excess war prizes. However, this contained no details, and with the Cold War, it wasn't possible to get confirmation. So, for decades, Graf Zeppelin's fate was unknown. There were rumors the Soviets repaired the ship for trials and developing their own carriers. And certainly the Red Navy at least considered that option before realizing it was too expensive for too little gain, politically or militarily. Other rumors, and these were put in printed sources, indicated the hulk struck a mine while under tow, this either sinking the ship outright or damaging her prior to scrapping. This also did not happen. As it turned out, the Soviets hadn't lied about destroying the ship in 1947. In August of that year, the battered hulk was towed out into the Baltic for weapons testing. With relations already cooling between the former Allies, the Soviets were quite interested in how to sink an aircraft carrier. Graf Zeppelin, incomplete and outdated or not, was a good guinea pig. The Soviets loaded up the ship with bombs to simulate damage from air attack. Then the ship was bombed by the Red Air Force, which must have severely embarrassed them because they scored 5 or 6 hits, out of around 90 bombs. With the hulk stubbornly afloat, the decision was made to torpedo the ship, to prevent her from drifting into shallow water. This finally caused enough flooding to sink the ship on either August 16th or August 17th, 1947. Sources differ on the exact day. The wreck would go undiscovered past this point, as Western authors speculated on the fate of the ship, until fairly recently, when a Polish survey team found a massive shipwreck in the Baltic, a wreck that shouldn't be where it was. After a sonar survey, the wreck was identified as Graf Zeppelin in late July 2006. The carrier rests at a depth of 80 meters, or 260 feet below the surface. This is fairly shallow, which makes the level of preservation all the more impressive. It's also within reach for experienced divers, although far from the easiest wreck to dive on. In any case, let's look at the wreck now, starting with the sonar imagery. This shows, as seen here, a wreck in more or less one piece. Graf Zeppelin's hulk hasn't broken apart, and all the major pieces remain in place, from the flight deck to the superstructure. Admittedly, in both cases, there is very visible damage. The elevators are missing, and there's a massive gash torn in the flight deck just aft of the superstructure. As for the superstructure, it's collapsed in the middle, right where the funnel would have been, which matches up with the records of the Soviet testing. They put a 1,000 kilogram, or 2,200 pound bomb in the funnel, which would certainly cause this kind of damage. For its part, the flight deck had another 1,000-kilo bomb on top of it, along with assorted bombs and shells placed in the hangar deck, and other smaller bombs either on the flight deck or suspended above it. Moving on though, let's look at other sonar images. First we have this shot looking at the wreck from starboard. It demonstrates that Graf Zeppelin came to rest on her starboard side with the remnants of the island here. This angle also gives a better view into the hole on the deck, which is torn up pretty badly. This is likely a mix of the initial testing damage and corrosion. The damaged deck and frames would have been the first to go, even on a wreck as well preserved as this one. And that damage becomes even more apparent on the next set of images. This is a set of 4 sonar scans, which give an even better look at the wreck, from multiple angles at that. I'll link the source of the image in the description, because it's a fascinating read if you're into things like this. In any event, the scans are helpfully labeled. You can see the platforms for the anti-aircraft guns that were never fitted, as well as a glimpse at the rudder and a shaft, and another look from 2 different angles into the hole on the deck. This extends from the middle elevator almost all the way back to the aft one. And finally, this set also gives a good look at the bow and stern, with a bit of the superstructure thrown in for good measure. From the same website, we also have this close look at the bow. It shows the bow elevator as well as the catapult. Graf Zeppelin, and by extension Aguila, which used the same design, had an interesting catapult. I've seen it described as a giant slingshot, which isn't necessarily wrong. It was a rather inefficient design and fairly slow to operate. It's also very distinctive on the ships, as seen here, and here on the surface with Aguila. With the sonar done though, let's move on to the wreck. This will be a bit of a reversal compared to the Petrel discoveries. In those cases, there's more focus on the wreck and less on the sonar. With poor visibility and no extensive ROV filming, Graf Zeppelin is the reverse. Much of this will be brief glances and from very close in. Take this, for example. I'm not sure where this is on the ship, but we have what looks like a break in the hull. This might be the torpedo damage. Without context clues, I can't be entirely certain. If it isn't the torpedo hit, it's still a break in the hull, which gives a good look at the overall condition. Because even here, while rusty, the ship isn't rusted out. The metal is intact, obvious break aside. On the topic of intact metal, we also have an anchor chain here. The rusting pattern is pretty visible, but it hasn't broken at all. The same goes for the hull next to it. And here we have another close-in look showing collapsed metal and what seems to be portholes. There's no real context clues on where this is, but I like this picture for how it shows the condition of the wreck. Graf Zeppelin is very visibly rusted here, but overall still intact. There's also no marine life. If this was a wreck at this depth in the Pacific, there would be far more rusting. And, of course, coral. The cold waters of the Baltic, on the other hand, have preserved Graf Zeppelin pretty well. You can see that here with collapsed ductwork. This has fallen onto the deck, along with what looks like wiring here. But, collapsed or not, this is still in pretty good shape, considering the depth and the fact the wreck has been underwater for nearly 80 years. That continues in the next shot with what looks like an open hatch. That's still fixed in place where it was opened, whatever it once was. Next to it, and on top of it for that matter, is more cabling. This has fallen down in a pile hanging from the ceiling. Just like the metal, it's in pretty good shape, which is easier to see here because there's not much in the way of silt either. As for the next picture, it continues the general theme. A penetration into the hull with a bunch of scattered debris, which is still pretty much intact here and here, other than falling on the deck. This area does have more sign of corrosion in the form of rusticles, which are never a good sign on a metal shipwreck, as Titanic could tell you. But even with the rusticles and other rusting, it could definitely be worse. There's even some framework here that's still intact, although whatever it supported is long gone. Now you've probably noticed these pictures are focused on the interior. That's because, as you can see here, the ship is covered in netting. It makes swimming on the exterior a bit risky. Those nets can and will entangle divers, and that leads to deaths even on easier dives than this one. I'm not surprised people avoid these areas. It does mean, however, that we've reached the end of the video with a picture showing a hole in the flight deck. This is pretty small, but looks to be battle damage, which implies either a light bomb or shrapnel from the detonations on the deck. What's probably more interesting, I think, is how the wood is still preserved. Although, as anyone who has visited Vasa can tell you, the Baltic is pretty good at preserving wood. That said, I'll wrap things up here. In the video description, I'll put a couple links to dive videos on the wreck. Those will give further glimpses at the deck and other such things, but it will still be pretty brief and foggy looks. Maybe someday we'll get an ROV survey akin to Petrel. For now, though, most of the interesting details on this wreck are limited to the sonar. Nonetheless, I find Graf Zeppelin to be an interesting wreck to look at, from both a historical and preservation perspective. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.